Hello everyone, it's Roger Capella bringing you the action from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. In This Week at the Club, episode number 10. This week is the second round of the Club Championship, which goes on for 5 rounds in the month of June. And I played on board 2 against Ed Harris. We had both won our first game. And in this game, Ed Harris had white, I had black. And we've played, about 4 times now recently, I think this year. And every time Ed's had white, and every time the game is opened in the same way, with Anderson's opening, pawn to queen rook 3 or a3 in algebraic notation. I responded, as I have every other time, with g6, which is kind of a flexible response, getting prepared to fianchetto the bishop. And knowing that I was playing Ed, I researched the various lines a bit. There are a lot of different possibilities coming after these first 2 moves of a3 and g6. The board is wide open, and white can continue a lot of different ways. But one of the ways I did look at is what was best if white just continued with e4. And it appeared that the best line in that case was to go ahead and steer basically into a Sicilian. It's kind of a hyper-accelerated dragon where I'm fianchettoing the dark-squared bishop. And the idea is that maybe in this line of the Sicilian, this pawn on a3 is not that important and might represent a wasted tempo on white's part. So play continued on. He didn't play sort of directly as a Sicilian, which would be knight to f3, but instead played bishop to c4, which is a fine move. I went ahead and fianchettoed. Then he played the knight out. And I was, at this point, after he played knight f3, I was feeling a little concerned about the tenderness of my f7 square here, because after this knight, for example, if it came up to g5 or something, it would be putting direct pressure on along with the bishop. So as a result, and just because it leads to a strengthening of this d5 square as well, I played e6. If you notice the board going dark every now and then, that's a kind of an annoying effect of the server I'm using at chess.com disconnecting. And if I make any moves during that period of time, I won't even recognize them. So bear with me. I'll try to maneuver around those. So I blunted the diagonal of the bishop here with the e6 move and prepared to play d5 myself to take more space in the center. He didn't play d4. I sort of expected him to play his pawn up to d4 instead, but instead chose to prepare that move with c3. It also blunts the diagonal of my bishop and keeps me from exerting quite so much pressure on the queen side. But it does give me time to play pawn to queen 4 myself, attacking his bishop. He exchanged pawns and then checked. And after this move, that I was feeling pretty good because I could simply develop the knight out. And my pieces are starting to look like they have kind of a harmonious development. But then he played d4, which of course I should have expected, and did somewhat. And the problem is that there's at least the threat now of d takes c, and I have to decide what to do about it. It's not a major threat. It's easy enough to defend it in a variety of ways. I could defend it with the queen on e2, for example, on e7 rather. I could come out here and attack the bishop, and at the same time, well, actually, probably not to that square, probably to b6, attack the bishop, and at the same time defend this square. But I didn't really like these sorts of ideas. If I did that, for example, he could trade off the pawns, and when I retake with the queen, his bishop could come out to e3 and attack my queen. So I didn't like the looks of that. So what I did was to go ahead and push that pawn. there's some drawbacks to this move, but there's also a nice aspect to it, which is that it makes this pawn that's on the pawn here on b2, which is a backward pawn, sort of weak. At least that's what I thought at the time. And if he ever pushes it, I could trade off, and then this c pawn becomes weak with pressure along the c file. But it turns out in the game that's not really the case, as you'll see. Ed went ahead and castled at that point. I played my knight to e7. If he pinned with his bishop to g5, I can simply unpin my queen, going to e7 to c7 rather, and that would take care of the pin of my e knight. And if he traded the bishop for the knight here on c6, I'd be totally happy with that. He didn't do that. He saw that I was getting ready to expand on the queen side, and rather than make the move, the retreating move when forced, he went ahead and prepared for it ahead of time. I castled. He played what was quite a good move here with the bishop, I think, capturing or rather taking control of this dark square diagonal, and in particular taking ownership of this b8 square, where I would really like in many variations to have my rook end up, and that's a factor in the game. So that ends up being quite a strong bishop along that diagonal. I went ahead and continued with my expansion on the queen side. He developed his knight, and I attacked his bishop. And the bishop, of course, only has one square to retreat to, which I'll go as soon as I get the server back. There it is. Okay. After the bishop retreated, then I had to do something with my bishop. So going back here for a second, the possible squares that I might develop it to really are these squares. I don't want to develop it to g4 because it could too easily get chased with this pawn move. And after you've fianchettoed, as I said before, it's when you get chased away by the pawn, you can't come back maintaining the pin, because then the bishop becomes trapped with the other pawn being pushed. So that square wasn't really open to me. These other squares were this square. All of those squares share the disadvantage of being trapped somewhat behind my pawns that are on the light squares. So with that logic, I went ahead and played my bishop to f5, and it threatens to trade off his good bishop that is not the color of his pawns, although it turns out in the game that this bishop on f4 is actually pretty good too. He did not choose to trade off immediately. He just developed the rook to the open file, and I went ahead and continued on with my pawn thrust on the queen side, threatening now to play pawn to b4, gaining more space and threatening maybe at some point to break through there. Ed played knight to e5. Okay, after this move, I've got to do something about that knight there in the center. It's a rather dominating knight, and if it gets reinforced by the other knight, it might be hard to dislodge it. I do have f7, f6 at some point still open to me. And the disadvantage of that move, of course, is that it locks in my bishop somewhat. So what I chose to do was to exchange it at this point, and he took back. Then I exchanged the other bishops because I wanted to move my knight, and the computer was comfortable with this. The computer at this point, though, actually liked the knight to be developed through f5. I couldn't see a great future for the knight over there on the king side. So in fact, what I did was played knight c6, and with the idea of supporting the pawn here which will soon be on b4 after I push it, and also threatening his bishop on e5. I was okay with him trading bishops off, even though that's my fianchettoed bishop taking protecting my fortress around my king. Taking back with the king is not too weak of a position because he has nothing that he can immediately invade on the dark squares with. Now, he chose to retreat the bishop back to g3. The computer says just leave it there and defend with the knight, and white is fine. In fact, white's got a slightly better game at this point. After retreating the bishop, it likes black a bit better than white, and I like black here as well. This mainly because of the pawns on the queen side that are threatening to actually start to cause some problems in white's queen side. I played a move now that looks a little odd, and mainly because I wanted to connect my rooks. I needed to put my queen somewhere. I didn't like my choices of where to put it. Putting it on this square, apparently allows the bishop to come into d6, but it actually doesn't, attacking my rook, and my rook would have to move, and now the bishop is commanding this square that I wanted to push my pawn to, and would prevent me from pushing forward with the pawn. The problem is that this fails tactically because I could simply play knight takes pawn, and now that opens up an attack on the bishop with my queen. So after he takes back the knight, I just take the bishop, and black has won a pawn. So that's not very good, and therefore he didn't do that. Instead, after bishop to, server, having troubles. There we go. After the bishop went back and I played queen to b6, he instead played b3. And this is a good move. I didn't expect it. Classically, when you have a pawn chain, you can either attack it at its base or at its head. This, of course, would be the base. It would be a place where you might expect to attack this pawn chain. This is the head of the chain. And so Ed went ahead and attacked the head. And it actually presents me with some problems, because if I take that pawn, he takes back with the knight, and then is able to come into this, after knight coming to b3, the next move would be for it to come to c5 here and have a very strong dominating square, and also it'd have this open file to work on. So I didn't really want to take it. I took a long time thinking about this move, about 20 minutes, which got me down to only 30 minutes left for the game, but I think it was time well spent. And after looking at my various options, I decided to not to take, and instead I played rook over. But it turns out that was not such a good move. I probably would have been better off retreating with my queen right away. The problem with playing the rook over is that he has this little tactical sequence of trading the pawns off, then trading the rooks off. I have to take back, check, and now he takes control of the b-file with his rook. And my queen has to go somewhere. If it goes here, then at some point the rook could, after he plays maybe rook to b2 or and then queen to b1, the rook could lead the charge here on the b-file and come up to b6. I instead decided to play the queen back to the king side and to start playing over there, to somewhat abandon my play on the queen side. Okay, Ed developed his knight, trying to come back through that important square on e5 again. And I played queen e7, and this prevents the rook from playing over to e1, because there'd be a simple mate in two. After rook to e1, the queen would take a check, the knight would have to take back, and then my rook would take mate. So it's a back rank mate pattern. So it prevents him from playing the rook to e1. But at the same time, it also attacks this pawn that's undefended on a3. And what's really necessary here is for white to play queen to b2, defending that pawn, and maybe at some point threatening to invade with the queen along the b file. Ed thought for a little while here, though, and didn't make that move. And the move that he made instead was king to f1. Go back. King to f1. There we go. And that's not a good move, obviously, because it simply overlooks the win of the pawn. And that pawn makes all the difference in the game. You wouldn't think that a small pawn there would be so important, but it does give black a passed a pawn, and that passed a pawn has a threat of running right up the side of the board and becoming a queen. And there's some tactics that flow out of that. So after I took the a pawn, white made a peculiar move, and there's a sequence of 3 or so moves that were less than optimum here, that were probably a little weak and caused some problems. And this was one of them. At the time, I didn't understand it. Afterward, I saw that he was vacating that c2 square for his knight to go to via e1 over to c2. But it allows me to go ahead and continue on with the pawn threat on the queen side. And in particular now I'm threatening to develop my knight into this square on b3 where it'll be a monster. It'll block the b file and attack his queen and support my pawn queening on a1. So it's a nice routing for the knight to go on. He went ahead with his plan of bringing his knight over to attack my queen, but it's too little too late, because I just continue on with this plan with my knight. And now this rook to b5 is actually a very serious mistake, but even if he'd made the best move here, which was to attack my queen, it still is not good, because I can attack his queen. If we trade off queens, that's not good for white, because this is a fork, check. King has to go that direction, and then I win the rook, and actually I'll win a whole rook here, because if he takes back with a knight, there's checkmate on e1. So that would be a very bad sequence. Instead of that, after this is fairly distracting, having the board light up and go dark and not be able to make moves whenever the server disconnects. But we'll step back a little bit here. After a4, instead he played rook to b5, and that's not good. The problem with rook to b5 will become apparent. I can still go ahead and play knight to b3, attacking the queen, and there are no good places for the queen to go, and the square he went to actually is quite bad, because then I can simply play h6, and this is a deadly problem, because I'm threatening right now to check on this d2 square with my knight, and the king would have to move away from the defense of his knight, and then there's checkmate on the back rank. So he has to stay along this dark square diagonal, protecting that, protecting the square. But I'm controlling most of the squares. The only square that isn't being controlled at this instant is f4, and if he went there, then I can simply push the g pawn and attack him on that square, and there's no place for his queen to go to that's good. So instead, he played knight to c2, and that unfortunately causes the end of the game, because even though it's attacking my queen, I can simply take his queen, and now he can't afford to take my queen back, because that will lead to checkmate when I go to c2. So he took my queen, and I checked on d2, and his king has to move away from the e-file, and that then allows checkmate with my rook on e1. So at this point, Ed looked at the board and resigned. So it's was kind of a turnaround there in about 4 or 5 moves after after he allowed the a pawn here to get captured with a king to f1 move. All of a sudden, the game really took a different turn, and I was back in the driver's seat. Up until that point, the last 4 or 5 moves before that, I felt that White was getting the initiative and that I was going to struggle to try to stay in the game. But having that pawn become loose and allow my successful invasion back on the queen side where I originally wanted to be was a real bonus. So I won the game. I'll go on. Next week there are 2 of us that have 2-0 scores, me and Ray Paulson, who's about 20-90 now. And by virtue of the colors that we've had, I'm going to have black again against Ray, so I'll have to be prepared for his d-pawn opening and his maybe Trompovsky attack or Torre attack or something like that he likes to play. But I'll bring you that action next week. We'll see how it goes. And until then, so long. Have fun at the chessboard. Bye-bye.